It's so nice to be here on Midsummer's Day at the Festival of Stories to talk about stories. And of course, the world is full of stories, and the world is full of storytellers. And some of you will know this, and some of you will need just that little bit of a nudge to understand that standing on a stage does not make you a writer any more than somebody sitting in a seat in an auditorium. Now, that was quite a good build-up, wasn't it? It kind of set your expectations rather high. What it didn't say was that I generally just ramble when I'm talking. And I generally just ramble when I write, too. But the title of my talk is We Are All Made of Stories. And this is one of the things that I keep repeating to people who ask me particularly, where do you get your ideas from? Because this is possibly the scariest and also the most depressing thing you can be asked as a writer, because the truth is, no one knows. They just come, don't they? They are everywhere. But you have to learn how to see them. You have to learn how to find them. And finding them and seeing them is sometimes as important or more so than telling them. Now, I was lucky. I was born in a house full of stories. There were stories from the basement upwards. And some of them were Yorkshire stories, because I had a Yorkshire family with a grandfather who had been down the mines and who had also been a gardener, but in his heart was also a poet and a bit of a magician, and who could hardly read, but who was an extremely good storyteller and an extremely good observer of a certain kind of life. I had a grandmother who had been in service in a house which to me sounds a bit like Downton Abbey, and she was full of stories of the understairs and the people above stairs and what they were like, and how funny it was that they hardly saw anything of what was going on in their house. And I had another family, a French family, and they too were filled with stories. I had a grandfather who had been a war hero, who had been decorated many times, who liked to do maths as a hobby, and who was slightly dismayed at the fact that I couldn't do maths, either recreationally or in any other way, and who tried very hard to draw me in to learning about maths by telling me stories. And I had two parents who were not quite so full of stories, because they were deeply literary people, and they were both of them teachers. And so at the dinner table, we got stories about teachers all the time. And it struck me at the time that something was going on in here, some form of subliminal indoctrination, because the child of teachers, the grandchild of a teacher, it seemed fairly clear that I was being genetically groomed to become a teacher through means nefarious and through stories about teaching. And I loved to hear them, and I paid attention because I was an only child and I was surrounded by people who were very good at drawing me in. And then I discovered that I liked to tell stories. I didn't have very much to tell at the time. I was very young, and I think you have to find your stories through your own life experience and the things that you've encountered and the people that you've met and the people you've spoken to and the places you've been. And I really only knew a small part of France and a small part of Yorkshire, but I liked to read. And I was also pretty good at doing voices. And so I liked to read authors and then try out their voices. And I found that I enjoyed doing that enormously. And the voices that I tried out were the voices of the people that I loved. And they tended to be quite muscular storytellers. Storytellers who talked about secret tribes and caverns underground and strange inventions and planets somewhere not quite in real space. And so I wrote that kind of thing and did a secret for a while. And then I came to my mother one day, having steeled myself for the conversation, because my mother was quite a tough matriarch, and I'd been told so often that I wanted to be a teacher that this was going to be a tough talk. And I said, I was about 7 or 8, I've been having a think about what I'd like to do when I grow up. I'm still having the same thing. And you know what? I think I'd like to write books, I'd like to tell stories. I would like to be one of those people who write these books that I read. And she said, oh yes. Is that so? And she led me to a room in our house which was walled with books. We didn't have much furniture, but we sure had a lot of bookshelves. And she showed me a wall of books written by dead French novelists, poets, who had all died in the gutter penniless of syphilis. And she said, darling, this is why you need a proper job. And it was excellent advice, because we all need a proper job, because creativity does not run on money or fear. There is enough fear out there already without the fear of not having any money being one of them. And so I went off and eventually I became a teacher. As, of course, I was destined to do. I do believe in destiny, and I believe it takes us to some peculiar places. But I also kept writing and collecting stories, because I loved them, and I knew that deep down it didn't matter whether I ever became one of those people on the shelves, those scary 19th century dead romantic novelists people, as long as I kept on telling stories and reading them and finding them and experiencing life in that way. Because you'll find as I talk that my stories tend to go round and round in circles, a little like the Midgard serpent swallowing its tail. But stories kind of do that, and they surprise you by cropping up again years after they began, years after you have given up the idea of ever finding the end. And sometimes that is the time at which they are at most potent. Now, when I was a small child, I had one particular favourite book, and it came to me via the library. Now, this was Barnsley Library, and Barnsley not being particularly great on culture, it was the one place you could be sure of finding stories, finding books, and I was very much looking forward to joining. Because most of the books in our house were in French, most of them were for adults, and there were lots of things that I was not allowed to read. My mother, being very practical, very French, felt that certain things would not contribute to my education and that I should be kept away from them. Sadly, this kind of encompassed a whole range of stories, which I later read, of course, without her permission and learned to love. It encompassed fantasy, science fiction, horror, comics, particularly comics. And all of this was classed as potentially dangerous and certainly time-wasting nonsense that I shouldn't have anything to do with. Of course, I wanted to do with it instantly. And so looking forward to joining the library was one of the great things of my young life, and I was told that I would be allowed to join when I was 7 years old, and that I would have a pink ticket, and this would allow me access to books. And I thought, great, because really, by then I had read all the books in my junior school library, which was very small, and I was just rereading them and making my own stories around them, and I was hungry for stories. And this is a story about the importance of libraries and how libraries shape us and how we should never undervalue libraries and their potential, because although we had books in the house, we didn't have the books that I wanted to read. And so on my 7th birthday, I joined Barnsley Library, which was a strange place, above the Centenary Rooms, which was a marble ballroom where elderly ladies went for tea dances, and there was a marble staircase that took you up there. And then above that there was a wooden staircase, and then another wooden staircase, and you finally got to the library, which was a kind of cathedral of books. Big vaulted archways in dark wood, and a kind of smell of dust and slight dampness, and it was utterly silent. I thought, wow, I live here. I want to live here. And there was an old woman at the front. I suspect she was probably about 35, but she seemed like an old woman to me. And she was very clearly there to make sure that people like me didn't go through into the library. Instead, she waved me towards a shelf, which was the children's library, and she said, you can have that. Those are books for you. Those are suitable books for you. Of course, instantly she said this, I wanted to know what the unsuitable books were. I wanted to read them. I wanted to write them. But I started with this shelf, and I found on that shelf what was to become my favourite book for years. Because my mother, although she despised fantasy and science fiction, anything that she felt was educational was all right. And this meant that there was a huge gap called mythology that kind of went into the fantasy and horror genre while still being educational and therefore perfectly all right. So I could still get the sort of incest and the big snakes and the giant demonic wolves and this kind of thing, but it was under the title of Improving Educational Literature. And I hurled myself on the mythology section like a starving animal. And the first book I got out was a book of Norse mythology called Thunder of the Gods. Now you will see as I continue, probably, assuming I get to it, that we are shaped very early. We don't always realise this, but our creative energy takes on shapes that we recognise from early childhood. And there was something about this book. There was something about the characters who seemed very familiar to me, even though they were clearly deities from a long time ago. They seemed awfully like real people from here and now. They were very human. They had distressingly sometimes human characteristics. They played jokes on each other. They did cruel, stupid things. They fell in love with the wrong people. And their stories were the stories of people who had died hundreds of years ago, but that were still alive, still being told, still being treasured and retold by people. And this book, Thunder of the Gods by Dorothy G. Horsford, became such a favourite that every time I went to the library I would borrow it, along with whatever other books I could get. And after a while the librarian would just see me coming and she would just pull out the book from the shelf and go, yeah, you want this, do you? And finally I managed to talk her into letting me join the adult library. I was 9. I was supposed to join when I was 16, and so I was obviously there on sufferance. And I had a blue ticket, one blue ticket a month, which would allow me access to one book. Now, the choosing of this book was very difficult. It was fraught with potential difficulty because not only did it have to pass my mother's test, it also had to pass the librarian's test. If she felt that it was unsuitable, if she felt that there was something in there that would either distress me or that I wouldn't understand and there would be questions afterwards, then she would just take the ticket away and I wouldn't have a book at all from that library for another month. And so on Saturday mornings when my parents went shopping, I would sit in Barnsley Library for hours, speed reading all the books I knew I couldn't possibly get away with, and then trying desperately to find a book that I knew would pass through the Scylla and Charybdis of these two enormous censors. And I wrote little stories about mythology throughout the whole of my adolescence, and even while I was teaching, because as you remember I did eventually go into teaching, which doesn't sound like much of a happy ending, but in some ways was the best thing that could have happened to me. It meant that I got a proper job, which pleased my mother no end. It also meant that I got access to what was effectively a sort of little factory of stories. Because some of you who will have read my books will know that although they are quite diverse in subject matter, there is a sort of human element that all of them share, and that is the concept of the small community and what happens within it. Very often the small community under pressure. I think that the authors that I have loved most have all understood that you don't have to go out and see the world to write stories, to collect stories. All you need to do is to look at the people around you. And we all understand small communities. We've all been in one. Whether you have lived in a village, or been to a school, or worked in an office, or even just been stuck in a lift with somebody for an hour, you will understand the chemistry of a small community. It means that wherever you are in the world, and the more I travel, and I haven't travelled much then, but the more I travel now, the more I realise that people and communities are essentially very similar. Behind cultural differences, the stories that we create are very similar. Because in every small community, or large community, and large communities are just agglomerations of small communities, there are people who fit, people who don't fit, people who gossip, people about whom other people gossip, people who make a difference without even meaning to, people who deliberately stir things. This is why we recognise, in the very best stories, we recognise ourselves, we recognise our friends and neighbours. And this is why things like myths and fairy tales are so powerful, because we don't really necessarily feel the need to believe in fairies or dragons or old gods, although some of us still do and some of us should. But we do understand that those things are means of articulating truths, which is why Mr. Richard Dawkins, though wise in many ways, is also a fool in many other ways, because denouncing stories because they are not real is a bit like saying that symbols don't mean anything just because they're squiggles on a page. These psychological squiggles that make stories up are what build the world. Everything is made of stories. Every community is made of stories. Every fairy tale, however bizarre, was created at some point to articulate a dangerous truth that could only be glimpsed through story. This is why fairy tales and myths tell us more about ourselves very often than books of science and of facts, because we are set up as human beings to seek out the truth behind symbols, to look at the psychological truth behind fairies and dragons and demons, and to understand that they are there to tell us something about ourselves. Now, in my particular small community, which was called Leeds Grammar School, there were many demons, many monsters, many gargoyles. Some of them were members of staff. Some of them were the actual gargoyles that were there outside my form room, because I was an unusual person in that environment. It was a boys' school. It was a grammar school. It was not the kind of school I'd been to. It wasn't the kind of school I really intended to teach in, but I just ended up there, teaching French and German in a community mostly made of teenage boys and elderly gentlemen. And it was the apotheosis of the small community. It was a factory of little stories. And I collected those stories without really realising it, because it was an interesting, closed arena for tragedy, for farce, for everything that could possibly lie in between. It was the kind of place where people see each other and their colleagues more often than they see members of their actual family. It was a place where huge silent wars had been fought over whether Dr. H had sat in Dr. A's seat sometime in 1981 without permission, whether somebody had taken somebody else's coffee cup. It was a stage for incredible, smouldering resentments. And of course, as soon as you're working with young people, there is the enormous mass of creative energy that comes from young people, because, and this is where people who knock YA fiction are missing the point completely, young people are the future of stories. They are making the stories right now. They're deciding what matters. And they all vote with their feet. They are not generally fooled with guff about whether something is a classic. They actually read with their hearts. And their enthusiasm is something that can't be faked. And so during all that time, I wrote my various books. I wrote one book to annoy my mother, because it was a horror book. Another book to annoy my mother even more, because it was a ghost story. And after that, I had a child of my own, and I realised what my mother had had to bear all those years. And I experienced that kind of pivotal moment, and I think a lot of writing comes from pivotal moments where we understand things about ourselves. I think nearly everybody who writes a first novel writes some form of coming-of-age novel. It is a normal thing for a younger writer or an emerging writer to write, because what have you got? Unless your life has been truly extraordinary, what do you have to write your first novel about but yourself? And so this is why so many young people write coming-of-age novels, and that's why also those coming-of-age novels take the form of different aspects of fairy story. One of them is the vampire novel, which I wrote partly to get away from my mother, but also partly because I think the vampire novel, though much maligned by the serious writing world, is another of those means of articulating psychological truths about our adolescence, our growth, our relationship with the world, our sense of needing to belong to a tribe, that sense of alienation that nearly all adolescents go through when they're encountering the world, the defiance against adulthood, all of that is masked under a sort of fairy tale, which says more about us than we know. However, when I had a child of my own, I realised that I was less interested in myself these days than I had been, and I was much more interested in other people. I was interested in my daughter, this young creature that had just come into the world that had all this potential, and who would create so many stories. And I was interested in where I'd come from, and my family, and my French family, and my Yorkshire family. And I brought a lot of those stories back out and looked at them in my mind. And although I'd had 2 books published and my publishers were all set to make me the new Anne Rice, I decided I didn't really want to be the new Anne Rice. The old Anne Rice didn't impress me that much. And I didn't want to be the new anybody. I wanted to be me. And so I started writing slightly different things. When we have Q&A, you might want to ask me about stuff like agents and publishers and dull things like this, but I'm going to skip over all that because it bores me. But my then agent, who was a well-meaning man who was all set to make money and who hadn't made any, and who was rather wanting to, decided that he wanted to find out why I wasn't selling in the States, or indeed anywhere. I had one fan letter for The Evil Seed from a young man living in Croydon, who I suspect should have gone out more. Maybe he got himself a real girlfriend, but anyway, it was my only fan letter, and I still got it. And he signed it from himself and his 2 cats. And I was very grateful because it was the one feedback that sustained me for years and years. Mostly for myself, and it showed. And my agent started to get antsy, as agents often do when they make no money at all. And so he sent one of my manuscripts to one of his friends in the States, a man called Al Zuckerman, whose book, How to Write the Blockbuster Novel, you may be familiar with. I wasn't. I wasn't familiar with Al Zuckerman, and I didn't know why my agent had sent my book to America, because I wasn't published there. But anyway, this guy was supposed to be some great expert. And so my manuscript went off, and he read it, and duly sent back about 50 pages on why I was totally getting it wrong. It was a very helpful 50 pages, if only in one respect. The people who know me well will understand that one of my strong motivating forces has often been to annoy people. And the 50 pages of Al Zuckerman's feedback just made me want to annoy Al Zuckerman enormously. And so I went through every one of his comments, which were many, but they basically boiled down to this. He said, first of all, yeah, you can write, but so what? You've got to write about the right kind of thing. For a start, you have to stop writing about small communities, because that's just rubbish and it's not representative of anything. And you need to be writing big stories. Now, I understand that you live in a small place, but you have to try and expand your vision. So forget about writing stories about villages and this kind of thing, because that's just messing around. Nobody in America is going to care about a village in France or somewhere like that. You know, it's not going to happen. Instead, think about cities, and think about the big themes that you get in cities, and think about rolling fields of American grain, and write a big novel that has scope. And I thought, actually, I don't know much about scope. I just know Leeds Grammar School, I know my family, I know Yorkshire, I know the island of Malmesbury. All my stories are little teeny stories, but you have to look at them to understand them. No, you can't do that, said Al Zuckerman. Instead, think big, think cities. And also, you're not having enough sex in your book. Really, you need sex, you need lots of sex, because people don't read books for stories. They read because they want to read sex scenes, and so have a sex scene in there, at least, you know, every 20 or so pages, and that'll keep it ticking along. Anyway, oh yeah, and what's with the old people? Why are there so many old people in your novel? Do you get rid of the old people? Nobody wants to hear about old people, and anyway, if you have the old people, you just can't have any sex scenes. That would be gross, and so get rid of all those. Oh yeah, and one more thing. You want to write a cookbook? there, it's just strange. And so I set off and I wrote a book by the numbers, doing everything that Al Zuckerman had told me not to do. And I set it in the tiniest of villages, and I filled the village with old people, and I just piled on the food, and there wasn't a single sex scene in there, and there wasn't a fist fight or a car chase or any reference to any cities or any vistas or anything like that. And I called it Chocolat, and it did quite well. That later, when the book had done really very well, and there was a movie, and it was published in 50 countries and all the rest of it, and Al Zuckerman came back to me via my new agent, and he'd obviously forgotten that he'd ever met me before, or had any kind of communication with me before, and he wrote a nice little letter saying, I understand that you know, you're a new emerging novelist, and maybe you'd like representation of the United States. If so, then I volunteer myself. And I went, no thanks, I've got it sorted. And that is Schadenfreude, and we don't get it very often, but when it happens, oh, it's great. So I went on, and I ended up giving up my job at Leeds Grammar School with much soul-searching, because 15 years at that place, and I thought, well, one of the things I thought was, for a start, what's my mum going to say? I'm going to lose the pension and the proper job and all the other stuff. And also, my deepest fear was that I would lose that human creative stimulus that had surrounded me all the time, this connection with different people every day, because actually the one thing about being a teacher, you may be exhausted all the time and not realise it, but you are never, ever bored, because every day brings you some new challenge or difficulty or confrontation or belly laugh, and it is quite difficult to give up that perpetual soap opera, but I did, because I realised that in spite of the fact that my other two books had been manageable with a proper job, this third one of mine wasn't manageable anymore. I was expected to do things and be a proper author and, you know, go on tour and talk to people in theatres and things. And so it took me a while to get used to that. But I went on writing different things, and one of my great fears really was that I would be asked to write the same story. And my whole childhood had been based on the idea that there are millions of stories out there. And I wanted to write, well, if not all of them, at least as many of them as I could handle. I didn't want to have to go back to the same story and write it over and over again. And publishing, of course, is perhaps less creative than writers would wish it to be. And publishers like people to write the same story. They like it because they can sell it under the same package to the same people and make the same amount of money. But I didn't want to do that, and so I wrote about things, and I have experimented with all kinds of different types of story, and although I would say that the discerning reader probably can still spot me in all of them, the less discerning publishers sometimes found it a bit difficult to cope with. Never mind. I can always go back to teaching, as my mother says optimistically. It's going terribly wrong. Now at this point, my daughter had reached a sort of age when I was starting to wonder what kind of books she would like, and she seemed to be growing up awfully like me. And so I remembered Barnsley Library and that book by Dorothy G. Horsford that had started me on mythology and the concept of fairy tales and myths actually being the most important substratum of storytelling. And I thought, I bet she's going to like that book. I'll go looking for it. And by that time, Barnsley Library had shut and everything had been sold off. And I couldn't find the book anywhere. It was out of print. It was unfindable. And so I went online and found myself a second-hand copy on Amazon, and ordered it. And it arrived in a brown paper package, and I took it out, and it looked awfully familiar. It had this green cover that seemed awfully familiar. And I opened it up, and there was the Barnsley Library stamp. And there was my little pink library ticket with my name written on it over and over again, in increasingly untidy handwriting. And this is one of the reasons that stories have stings in their tails, and they come back to find you when the time is right. Because I think stories always lead somewhere. When I'm writing, I rarely quite know where I'm going to finish, but I always know that it's going to take me somewhere. The real challenge is to try and make sure you end where you're supposed to be. People often ask me about my process, and I often tell them that it's a little bit like a walk through the woods. I kind of know more or less where I'm going to end up, but what I'm going to find on the way is just impossible to quantify. And I wouldn't even try to quantify it, because actually for me half of the fun of storytelling is the journey, is knowing that you may find interesting things. Your story may surprise you. You may surprise yourself. I don't see how I could possibly surprise readers if I didn't surprise myself at least on some level. And so I don't seek to know the end of the story, because we don't know in real life where stories are going to take us. I think the whole of our life is based on a series of stories that go round and round and eventually surprise us with some form of revelation. I'm going to give you an example of this. I have a kind of theory about the chaos effect of stories. Because my old granddad, my English granddad, used to tell me sticks and stones will break your bones, but words will never hurt you. He was wise in lots of ways, but he was wrong in that. Because actually stories and words are the building blocks of stories, but stories are the most powerful thing we've got. Stories are what we leave behind. Stories are how we communicate with people, how we create connections with people all over the world. It is the way we reach out to people, and we reach out to the things that link people rather than the things that make them different. And they can take us all kinds of places. A properly written story, a story which goes out there into the world, can do all sorts of things. It can change somebody's life. It can make them want to read. It can put them off reading, which is equally scary. It can make them want to do something that they never thought about before. It can empower them. My little story, Chocolat, seems to have empowered a lot of people to start their own chocolate shops, which was one of those very odd consequences that I never considered would happen, because for a start I was told it wouldn't sell, and also it seemed to me to be such a fairy story that I didn't realise that people might possibly see a truth about themselves behind that story and go out and investigate it. But that particular story has led me a long way. It's led me to so many countries, to so many places and people that I'd never have encountered, and it has spawned a multitude of other stories all around it. Some of them belong to me, others belong to other people entirely. One of these stories, I'll just tell you one, because it is about the magical power of stories, the chaos effect of stories, the fact that the turn of a page on one continent can do extraordinary things on another one. After I had written Chocolat, my publishers asked me to write a cookbook. I didn't want to write a cookbook, I'm not really a great cook, but there were recipes in Chocolat and in my other foodie books, and people wanted them. And I thought, maybe I should do this, it might be fun. And I will give the money away, I'll give it to a charity. I had one particular charity in mind, that was Médecins Sans Frontières, who had a sleeping sickness program in the Congo. And I'd read about this, and I'd thought, one of these days, in the days when I didn't have any money to give to anything, one of these days, if I ever make a real pile, I will give some money to this charity. And so I gave the proceeds of my cookbooks, 2 of them, to MSF, and MSF sent me off to the Congo. I stayed there longer than I'd intended. I stayed there for 3 months, and I went downriver in a canoe, and I had many, many adventures. And some of them I wrote down, and some of them were stories that I'd collected from other people, and I wrote those down too. But this one I haven't written down. But it is totally true. And I met, way downriver in a village that was being screened for sleeping sickness, which is a horrid disease, 100% fatal if not treated, 100% treatable if it's found in time. And I found a very old woman. She was very old even for us. She had to be in her 90s. She was particularly old for the Congo, where the average age is about 19 or 20. And she spoke French. She remembered what it had been like. And we talked a great deal. She'd never been out of her village. she found it difficult to visualise where I had come from. But we found that we had stories in common. And she knew stories about magic and voodoo and rivers and trees and witches, and so did I. And so I taught her all about the Pendle witches, and she told me all about the wizard who lived by the river, who would ride in a toy plane. And we found that the stories had many, many things in common. And she thought it was hilarious that I wrote stories for a living, and that I'd written this cookbook, and that this cookbook had meant that she could be cured of sleeping sickness, because she was very ill, and she would have died if she had been left for another couple of weeks. And she was bored because it's a tricky treatment, and she had to take it intravenously, and she had to lie in a tent in the bush with nobody to talk to her. And so I talked to her for a while, and then her family arrived, and there were lots of them. 20 people, and they all sat round her, and I thought how touching that her family had come to keep her company in this difficult time. And then I listened to what they were saying. And they were saying, "Mother, give it up. You're wasting the time of these good Mendele people who have come to heal you. You're not going to live long anyway. You might as well just give up and die now." And she was going, "No, no. I will outlive you all. I have the gift." And I thought, damn, this is a woman after my own heart. She's going to live just to piss off her relatives. And so I stayed with her and spoke to her and collected many, many stories from her, because she was immensely wise and full of the lifetime's experience of living in this village where nothing and everything happened. And she is the one who gave me my theory of the chaos effect of stories, because she kept telling me, you say you don't believe in voodoo, you say you don't believe in magic, but look at me. You make these squiggles on a page, and over here I'm taking this medicine into my arm, which means that I will live forever. And that is magic. And when she left, it was also the day that I left, and she walked off into the jungle with all her possessions on her head. She was about this high. And so it made her about 8 feet tall, and I walked off to my canoe in the other side, and she said, "Just remember this. Stories do everything. Stories are magic. A story can save the life of somebody on a different continent, somebody who didn't even know you were alive. You should keep writing. You should encourage other people to keep writing. Write some of mine. They're good stories." And so I did. And I still do, and I write all the stories that I find around me, because the world is made of stories. People are made of stories. There is not a single boring person in the world, because they are all hiding something, and it is my job and your job to find that out. Thank you very much, all of you, for listening. A couple of questions, and we've got time. Yes?
Did your daughter like your book of Norse myths?
I'm going to repeat the questions for the audio. Did my daughter like my book of Norse myths? Yes, she did. She did, and she liked the other 2 books that I wrote really for her, which were also about Norse myths, because I found that my daughter is also full of stories, and many of them are the ones that I loved when I was her age. Yes?
Well, you talked about ideas, and you said that it's a terrible question because real ideas, you don't know where they come from anywhere. So what do you do if you're in the middle of writing a story, and you get one of these ideas pop in there? What do you do with that idea?
I write it. I write. This is a story about ideas and how fast they come. And yes, if you're writing one idea, and another idea comes, what do you do with it? I tend to write them down, sometimes in short form, sometimes on Twitter, which I find is also a factory of stories. And sometimes in notebooks, because I know that, although I think I'm going to remember all the ideas I've ever had, I don't. And so I will just jot them down and hope that they will still be good at the time when I want to come back and write them down. With me, it's never really a matter of finding ideas, but deciding which ones I want to spend time on, because a book will take a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years to write. What do you do with all the other stories that come knocking at your door? My answer is often to write short stories, because sometimes I get an idea and I know that I won't want to spend a year or 2 years writing it, but I do want to get it down. And so I will write it down, and everybody will tell you that short stories don't sell, but selling is not always the primary objective. And things that don't sell today may sell another day, or may spawn something completely different later in a year, in 10 years' time. I put you off now, haven't I? Yes?
You talked about sort of harvesting stories from other people. If you're the custodian of somebody else's story, how do you deal with that responsibility, and how do you communicate to them that you've taken their story?
This is a question about other people's stories and writing other people's stories, and it's interesting that you used the word custodian. I don't see it as being a custodial task. Obviously, if I were writing somebody's biographical story, then I would talk to them about it. But I find that doesn't happen with me. What I tend to do is I observe, I talk to people, I filter what I've found, so that even that person would not necessarily recognise their story anymore. I might use fragments of it or something that it has suggested. But I don't think of it as being, a story is not to me an enclosed thing. I think there is a sea of stories and we all kind of plunge into it and we borrow what we can, and it's effectively the story of the human race and the things that are important to human beings, and so saying that something is one person's story it doesn't quite work with me. That assumption doesn't really compute with me. I mean, I have to say, as a sort of as a warning, sometimes it can be quite difficult if you do put somebody in a story and they recognise themselves. I mean, people recognise themselves all the time, even when we've not met. But when I was writing Chocolat, I had only a small pool of stories to dip into and a small pool of characters, and I didn't have the time or the money to keep going off and observe villages in France, and so I created my French village from basically people from Leeds Grammar School. One elderly gentleman that I put in there, not terribly well concealed, with his dog. And of course, Al Zuckerman had told me that this wouldn't sell, and so I was just doing it for fun. But finally, when the book had gone stratospheric and there was a movie and all these other things were happening, it became increasingly obvious that if I had wanted to keep his identity secret, I should have changed the name of the dog. The upshot being that 2,000 Leeds Grammar School boys recognised Mr. Fry and Charlie, and I kept getting lots of questions like, who's going to play Mr. Fry in this? Who's going to play Charlie? My denials became increasingly feeble, and of course when the movie came out it was even more difficult, and I took him to the one cinema in Leeds that would let him take the dog, and we sat through the movie, and every time his character came on screen I would hear this extremely intake of breath, and the dog would whine, and the movie is quite a long movie, and I was feeling quite stressed by the end of it. I was quite an elderly man even then, and I supported his elbow as he staggered out of the cinema, and I said, well, Mr. Fry, what do you think? And he looked at me with eyes like stars and said, oh, Mrs. Harris, they've made me so tall. So yeah, always change the name of the dog. Yes?
Are there any stories you won't tell?
Are there stories I won't tell? I can't think of any. I don't think I would want to tell dull stories about people that I wasn't interested in. But I don't think that I've got a boundary in terms of, things that I think would be too tricky or too risky. I mean, I like risk. I think it's, in some way, it is the galvanizing force behind my storytelling, the idea that I would like to try something different. I wouldn't do something that somebody else had thought of and I thought they were going to use it. I wouldn't do something that I think would upset somebody who I know who is still alive, if it were an obvious reference to something that had happened to them. But no, I think the rest of it, pretty much everything is up for grabs. Yes, at the back.
How easy was it for you to get published?
not easy at all. It took me 2 years to get an agent, and it took him another 2 years to get me a publisher. It's never as easy as people think it is. It's never as easy as the media makes it sound. I mean, I thought it was hilarious when Chocolat did come out and made it big, where people were talking about it being a kind of Cinderella story, and I was thinking Cinderella worked bloody hard for a long time before the story happened. It takes a lot of hard work to be an overnight success, and sometimes it takes years to become an overnight success, but yeah, it took me a long time. I would advise anybody not with an agent to consider going with an agent, just because I tried without an agent with no success whatever for absolutely ages before realising that publishers do not listen to anybody who doesn't have an agent. The agent is basically the voice of the Metatron. You just don't get an ear until you have somebody to speak for you and to say that you're right and you're worthy. Of course, in those days, self-publishing is an option. Now there are many, many more options, but it's still kind of quite nice to get somebody who's in the know and who can advise you, because as far as I know, most authors are just terribly grateful to be in print and would probably do pretty much anything to be in print, including work for free. And most publishers, knowing this, are quite happy for authors to work for free, and sometimes will even ask them to pay for the privilege. I don't think they should be allowed to do this. Agents kind of stop you from letting yourself in for this kind of thing. Yes? One.
How do you resist the pressure from the publisher not to be yourself, but to do what the market wants?
How did I resist the pressure from my publisher it's an excellent question, to do what the market wanted? Well, there were two things. One, I was incredibly naive when I got my publisher for Chocolat. And in parentheses, it took a long time for Chocolat to get a publisher, because nobody knew what it was. They didn't know whether it would sell or not. They were a bit like Al Zuckerman. Also, it wasn't a vampire novel or a ghost story, and they kind of thought, well, ooh, why has she done something different? You know, it's like when you do something to your hair, and people go, you look funny. Anyway. What's that just me? But yeah, I mean, having found one winning formula, as they thought, they wanted me to do to others. But when I signed up with Transworld, I said, you know, you and I are going to get on just fine as long as you don't do either of two things. They are deal breakers. If you do them, I will find somebody who doesn't straight away. One is you will never tell me what to write next. Two, you will never give me a deadline. And how could I have said this? I had no idea how publishing worked. On the other hand, I was number one and I had a movie. And they said, yeah, all right. And since then, they have never given me a deadline, and they've never told me what to write next, with the exception of the odd suggestions for cookbooks, which don't quite count. I think, however, it's mostly due to the readership, because, you know, I have a very loyal readership, a very tolerant and accepting readership, who by now, I think, have understood that I don't necessarily stay within the box. And they are mostly happy to accompany me out of the box and to understand that actually being out of the box is what makes me where I am. And so I think the readers have kept me where I am, just by following me and reading the things that I do. Otherwise, I'd probably still be looking for another publisher now, because, you know, publishers are not great at risk. But yeah, so far I am lucky, and people like you did that, so thank you. Thank you very much.